So out of the 12.5 million Africans doing the Atlantic slave trade, only 388,000 made it to the United States. They started mixing with the Black Indigenous slaves that was here already, and that's the beginning of the ethnogenesis that we went through to become what we are today, foundational Black Americans. So in South America and in the Caribbeans, they enslaved population numbers. Peace, foundational Black American family. Welcome back to another episode of FBA Network Podcast. Today, we gonna deep dive into some FBA history. Let's go. Majority of enslaved Africans in the transatlantic slave trade were transported to South America and the Caribbean rather than to the United States. Now here is a breakdown to put all this into perspective. Historians estimate that of the 12.5 million Africans forcibly transported across the Atlantic during the Atlantic slave trade, approximately 4.9 million were sent to Brazil. Another 4 to 5 million was sent to the Caribbean, to colonies controlled by the British, French, Spanish, and Dutch. Only around 388,000 were directly shipped to that what will become the United States. So only 4% of Africans in the transatlantic slave trade was brought to the U.S. Why did more people go to South America and the Caribbeans? Labor demand. Sugar plantations in Brazil and the Caribbeans required a massive labor force, as sugar was an extremely labor-intensive crop and a highly profitable export for European powers. The brutal conditions and high mortality rates on sugar plantations meant that enslavers continuously imported more Africans to replicate those who died. Climate and geographic also played a part. The tropical climates in South America and in the Caribbean were more conducive to crops like sugar, coffee, and tobacco, which were in high demand in Europe. These regions were more agriculturally dependent on enslaved labor than the U.S. was, especially during the colonial period. Enslaved Africans in the Caribbean and South America, they face horrific worse conditions. Diseases like yellow fever and malaria, on top of all them cruel work conditions, that led to a much lower life expectancy. What made slavery different in the United States is that the slave population grew through natural reproduction. So out of the 12.5 million Africans doing the Atlantic slave trade, only 388,000 made it to the United States. They started mixing with the Black Indigenous slaves that was here already, and that's the beginning of the ethnogenesis that we went through to become what we are today, foundational Black Americans. So in South America and in the Caribbeans, their enslaved population numbers didn't grow through natural reproduction. They just kept importing more slaves. So that's why so many Africans were shipped to the Caribbeans and South America and not the United States. Even though a smaller percentage of enslaved Africans were brought to the U.S., slavery still played a pivotal role in the country's development. Unlike the Caribbean and South America, the enslaved population in the U.S. grew significantly due to forced reproduction. By 1860, the enslaved population in the U.S. had grown to nearly 4 million. The labor of enslaved people in the U.S. fueled the production of cash crops like cotton, tobacco, and rice, making the U.S. a global economic power. While the majority of enslaved Africans were sent to South America and the Caribbean, the relatively smaller number brought to the U.S. had an outsized impact on the nation's economy and culture. South America, particularly Brazil, received the largest share, but all regions where slavery was practiced shared a legacy of exploitation and systematic inequality. There is historical evidence that Black indigenous people in the Americas, including those in what would become the United States, intermarried and reproduced with Africans brought over during the transatlantic slave trade. The mixing of cultures, traditions, and bloodlines happened in various contexts, including enslavement, resistance movements, and the establishment of maroon communities. Here's how this unfolded. The interactions between indigenous people and Africans were shaped by the colonial and slavery systems. The enslavement of both groups. In the early colonial period, indigenous people were enslaved alongside Africans. This coexistence on plantations and in colonial households created opportunities for interactions and relationships. Shared resistance. Both groups faced oppression and often found solidarity in resisting colonial systems. Some Africans escaped bondage and sought refuge with indigenous communities, leading to intermarriages and the blending of cultures. Maroon communities. Maroon society were communities formed by escaped enslaved Africans, often in remote areas in places like Florida, the Caribbean, and South America. These Maroons frequently allied with or integrated into indigenous tribes. For example, the Black Seminoles in Florida emerged from such alliances between African escapees and the Seminole tribe. These communities often developed unique cultures, identities that combine African and indigenous traditions, including shared languages, food, and spiritual practices. Demographics and forced reproduction. By the 1800s, the majority of enslaved Black people in the United States were born domestically rather than brought directly from Africa due to the abolition of the international slave trade in 1808. In areas where Black indigenous people existed, particularly in the Southeast, they reproduced with Africans who were brought through the transatlantic slave trade, further blending these lineages. Evidence in genealogy and oral histories. Many foundational Black Americans today have oral histories and genetic markers that indicate a mix of African and indigenous ancestry. This reflects generations of interactions between the two groups during slavery and beyond. These connections highlight a shared struggle against colonial oppression and a complex blending of identities that continues to influence foundational Black American culture in the U.S. Black indigenous people intermarried and reproduced with Africans brought over during slavery. This blending created a rich culture and genetic legacy that has contributed to the diversity of foundational Black American heritage. These relationships were often forged in the tribulations of shared resistance and survival, laying the foundation for unique communities and cultural expression that are still evident today. If you made it through another one, I appreciate your patience. Like and subscribe. The more you support the channel, the more information I could bring and do this thing full time. Peace, FBA family.